Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always a conference that I look forward to. It's probably the conference I look forward to the most each year, because I think it's one of the few conferences, I think, as Petar put it at the beginning, where it's not so much about the audience per se or the size of the audience. It's about a true engagement with what the Germans would call die Sache selbst. The thing in itself, and I think that's the case. So it's always a pleasure to be here. So thanks to Nathan again, Petar and Tom for inviting me. Hopefully the paper won't disappoint, because I think I'll be addressing the three pillars: pessimism, nihilism, and dandyism. Not necessarily in that order, or maybe actually in that order, but what I'm going to try to do with this paper, which is still somewhat rough, so I hope you can bear with it, but it's going to be tracing a thread, taking up the question of nihilism as being one of the nodes through which the subject registers what Castoriadis has called the enormous anthropological mutation that capitalism brings about. And so I'm interested in this idea of how can we come to grips with this enormous anthropological mutation. And so the thread that I want to chart is through the problem of nihilism, how that addresses the problem of value, and how it is that a subject comes to manifest a relationship to value that is not merely a negation of it, but holds itself at a distance from the value form. And I think the dandy might be one of the figures that's an interesting case for how one might do that. So I'd like then just to begin with a couple of very short aphorisms, because I seem to always like to do that. So the first one is from Jean-Joseph Gueux. No biologist's scalpel has ever found a person's soul or anima, just as hitherto no chemist has been able to discover exchange value in a pearl or a diamond. And the next one is actually from a book by Castoriadis called The Figures of the Thinkable. One can do with the psyche almost anything, make it a Buddhist, a Christian, a bourgeois, a Nazi, etc. But what society cannot do is stop furnishing it a meaning. The experience of modernity begins with the experience of diremption, what Hegel identified with the monstrous power of negativity, or what Blaise Cendrars describes as the frantic loosening of all ties at work in every level of society that throws the natural order of things hopelessly out of kilter. Conditioning the very possibility of critique, negativity forces thought to confront the contingency of meaning, the sheer arbitrariness of social distinction, exposing its perilous foundation and awakening that most dangerous of sensibilities, the uncanniest of guess, nihilism. If Kant only peered into this abyss with a sidelong glance, harnessing negativity to the task of transcendental synthesis, the nihilist locates the function of negativity not in the synthesis, in its relation of binding, but in its unbinding, dissolving, subtracting, and in the last instance, destroying capacity. With nihilism, the utmost disparity occupies the scene, and the nihilist seizes upon the moment of dismemberment, identifying with the powers of dissolution so as to fully occupy the open road, as Nietzsche put it, to new forms and refinements of the soul hypothesis. The most Luciferian of philosophical positions, it seeks to deprive negativity of its magical power of converting the nothing into being. The nihilist tarries with the destructive rather than transformative power of the negative, attempting to strip thought of its Geist, of its spirit, and risking the scorn that the philosopher always reserves for the cynic and the stupidity of those who identify thought with the ultimate nullity of its substance, not death, but bone. For Hegel, let us recall identifying the life of the brain, consciousness, with the nullity that encases it, the skull or the caput mortuum. Passing off bone as the reality of consciousness, as he puts it, amounts to the complete denial of reason. So here's an extended passage from the section dealing with the phrenology in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. The skull bone is not an organ of activity, nor even a speaking movement. We neither commit theft, murder, etc. with the skull bone, nor does it in the least betray such deeds by a change of countenance, so that the skull bone would become a speaking gesture. Nor does this immediate being have the value even of a sign. Look and gesture, tone of voice, even a pillar or post erected on a desert island directly proclaim that they mean something else than what they simply are at first sight. They at once profess to be signs, since they have in them a peculiarity which points to something else, by the fact that it does not properly belong to them. A variety of ideas may well occur to us in connection with the skull, like those of Hamlet over Yorick's skull, but the skull bone just by itself is such an indifferent, natural thing that nothing else is to be directly seen in it or fancied about it than simply the bone itself. It does indeed remind us of the brain and its specific nature, and of skulls of a different formation, but not of a conscious movement, since there is impressed on it neither a look, nor a gesture, nor anything that proclaims itself to have come from a conscious action. For it is an actuality whose role it is to exhibit another sort of aspect of the individuality, one that would no longer be a self-reflected, but a purely immediate being. Sheer indeterminacy, utterly meaningless, the skull bone refers to nothing other than its own immediate, abstract, and empty being. A gaping void that cleaves thought, resisting absolutely consciousness's identification. It locates the gap that Kant first intimated when opening consciousness, apperception, onto the indeterminate being of the I, the non-representable void of matter in itself, right? Stripped of sense, devoid of life, without direction or aim, the nihilistic kernel of Kantian critique that, let us imagine, provoked Kleist's infamous Erschütterung, right? This sort of shattering that occurred when he read Kant's first critique, and I think I've sort of referenced this now probably each year that I've been here. It is to this kernel that Nietzsche himself returns in the famous fable that opens on Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, which concludes with the assertion that nothing will have happened. So I kind of excised this quote, not to take too much time, but many of you are probably familiar with it, but he sort of begins with this fable of, this sort of once, there once was a creature in the cosmos that invented truth, and it goes on, and then he sort of in the end, basically the utter insignificance of this is sort of less significant, is as insignificant as a sort of tossing a grain of sand into the ocean sort of thing. And he concludes it then with this idea that nothing will have happened. So if meaning, and above all the need for meaning, is a distinctly human prerogative, as both Kleist and Nietzsche conclude from their reading of Kant. So this is, I think, what Kleist and Kant both see, is that, in other words, what the problem that Kant poses is that meaning as such is itself a distinctly human concern or prerogative. Then the exigency of brute matter, liquidated of sense, the thing in itself in Kant, forces thought, when it's thought, to accept the void of its concern. The threat of nihilism, then, is the stupor of thought, indeterminacy without determination. And the nihilist concludes, the advent of human, all too human, cognition amounts to nothing decisive, a difference that fails to make a difference, ultimately, when it is all over with the human intellect, nothing will have happened. This hole in the synthetic fabric of sense opens up an irreparable gap cleaving nature and culture, matter and value. And it is precisely this gap that concerns Hegel in his description of the logic of pure culture, and it is also this gap that will once again be exposed by Marx's account of the logical genesis of the value form in the first book of Capital. It is a gap then that is fully exposed only once value as such is put into question. So I'm going to turn now to a very brief account of Hegel, and then on to a reading of Marx. So culture emerges as an object of conscious concern only once value as such, as I just said, value in itself, becomes a problem, which is to say that its form is no longer wedded to a determinate content. Pure culture is the abstraction of value, which still articulates itself through distinction, that is, value judgments. Things are judged good or bad. Subjects are deemed noble or ignoble. But the content of these judgments are no longer bound to their form. The very content of the form of power is thus no longer linked to wealth. The good is no longer linked, the good to the bad, or the noble to the ignoble. To quote Hegel, what is learnt in this world is that neither the actuality of power and wealth, nor their specific concepts, good and bad, or the consciousness of good and bad, the noble and ignoble consciousness, possess truth. On the contrary, all these moments become inverted, one changing into the other, and each is the opposite of itself. Goodness or nobility no longer hinge on an intrinsic quality, but is now bound precisely to that which it is not, the bad, the ignoble. So the goodness, in other words, goodness in itself becomes a relational term, and likewise nobility. So they can only be understood in relationship through a negation of their opposite. The form of the good or the noble consists in the judgment that distances it from the bad or the ignoble. Empty in itself, goodness or nobility become expressions then of a disparity. This is what Hegel calls the language of disrupted consciousness, whose judgments become nothing other than, quote, a nihilistic game which it plays with itself. Culture is the symptom of the dissolution then of the tie that binds the subject that judges to the object judged. There is no longer, according to Hegel, any necessity linking the two moments together. There's connection. The connection is itself now arbitrary. Goodness no longer belongs to the thing. It's no longer intrinsic, but is an attribute of the subject that makes the judgment. But likewise, the subject who makes the judgment is no longer in possession of a nobility intrinsic to his subject position that gives it an objective position in the world, giving content to the judgment. As Hegel puts it, all identity dissolves away, for the utmost disparity now occupies the scene. What is absolutely essential is now absolutely unessential. Being for self is now external to itself. The pure I itself is absolutely disrupted. Consciousness in practice is thus dirempted, incessantly prompted to divide itself between contradictory demands. And so I'm basically saying is that this is Hegel's own account of the bourgeois revolution. In other words, of this account of a separation in which there is no longer a relationship between the judgment, the moral judgment of the good, that's then grounded in one's social substance, which would be nobility. So that now, in other words, one can lay claim to being good or to being noble without necessarily possessing that substance. And so this, I think, is Hegel's own account of the very fact that what the bourgeois revolution does is it dissociates social position from any sort of intrinsic or natural quality, or substantial quality would be a better way of putting it. The romantic artist, in Hegel's analysis, is the figure who attempts to take this diremption to its utmost extreme, identifying the very substance of the subject with the process of its dissolution. The artist becomes the paragon of all creatures of culture, to allude to Agamben's first book, A Man Without Content. Separated from its reality, the artist can only touch on the real through identifying with the disparity that marks this separation. Art likewise seeks its reality in itself, art for art's sake, locating its essence in the disparity of the real. Its central contradiction consists in attempting to make its form the very expression of its content. The work itself, then, is reduced to the subjective decision that gives it formal coherence. A movement of pure negativity, its content being nothing outside of the formal expression of its division, the romantic artist terminates in negation, in a kind of suicide. Unsatisfied with negating the world, the quest for pure form can only turn on the subject, whose content is its form. The romantic subject then becomes a form of self-dissolution, Selbstauflösung, a self-annihilating nothing, what Hegel calls ein nichtiges, ein sich vernichten, this one's hard to say, ein nichtiges, ein sich vernichtendes. And so Agamben summarizes this situation, I think, quite well. This is a quote from Agamben. Artistic subjectivity without content is now the pure force of negation that everywhere and at all times that affirms only itself as absolute freedom that mirrors itself in pure self-consciousness. Inalienable and yet perpetually foreign to itself, art still wants and seeks its law, but because its link with the real world has grown weak, everywhere and every occasion, it wants the real precisely as nothingness. Art is the annihilating entity that traverses all its contents without ever being able to attain a positive work because it cannot identify with any content. And since art has become the pure potentiality of negation, nihilism reigns in its essence. Art then, like the bone, is an annihilating entity not because it reduces everything to death, but because it is unable to die, separating itself in its nullity from any sense-giving negativity. This is what separates the nihilism of the work of art from the nihilism of the commodity. The commodity is the very embodiment of negativity put to work, the key ingredient of the production of value, which crowns the commodity like a halo. So now I'm going to shift to Marx. Drawing on Marx's analysis of the fetishism of the commodity, we can say that the determination of the thing as commodity, its passage in Marx's terms from being a thing of use, whose determinations are bound up with its array of qualities, to something not merely exchangeable per se, but something with an exchange value, symbolizable in cash, and therefore quantitative terms, is a passage from the thing's material to its spiritual being. The metaphysics of the commodity has to be taken quite literally. It is important to stress, since it is easy to overlook, that the quantitative dimension of value is not merely quantitative, even if it appears as such and can really be treated as such. For the quantity expresses a relation to a use that has been negated. Its substance consists in and through that negation. And so this is how I read why the fetish is produced, is because quality does not disappear, but is retained as a negation. Value as such emerges an object for consciousness only once a gap has been established through practice between a thing and its qualities, allowing for the thing to be separated from itself, or in Marx's terms, separated from the determinate uses to which it can be put. Put differently, exchange does not annihilate use, but suspends it, enabling it to be activated and reactivated for the sake of exchange. Expressed abstractly, we can define the commodity as that which maintains a relation through its negation to that which it is. Its elusive substance consists in including a relation to that which it excludes, so that the commodity is itself, in other words, it includes a relationship to that which it is not, namely its qualitative determinations. Only as such is it the hypostasis or the reification of a social relation. So in this world, things then have value, so in the world of the commodity. And ultimately subjects, too, only have value, only insofar as they are divided against themselves. And yet this division itself cannot be absolute. It must be relative. The dialectic of the commodity and likewise of the subject implicated by its machinations cannot do away with this moment, with the moment of its qualitative inscription. So this becomes very important for my argument. So may as well just stress that. As Benjamin intimated, the social bond of capital does not do away with religion, as Marx at times seemed to suggest, but institutes it in its purest form. A commodity is not merely a bearer of exchange value, but also has its use, and likewise the subject is not merely a subject, but a person. Right? And so this is going to become an important point for me. The subject is is a personalization within the commodity form. So if the revolutionary tendency of the bourgeoisie, as Marx suggests, consists in drowning the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation, and resolving personal worth into exchange value, it must at the same time initiate a counter-revolutionary thrust that gives rise to countless sentimental narratives, religious palliatives that inscribe the subject into capital at the personal level as a subject that believes in value and its own self-worth. This is not a mere ideological supplement, but internally necessary to the very propulsion of capital, the expansion of the value form. So one of the enduring legacies of Marx's analysis of the fetish of commodities is to show that the abstract potency of capital's unrelenting expansion of the logic of exchange produces a natural illusion, a belief in the value of value. The notion of the value of value is sustained by the structural equivocation and contradiction between use and exchange value that acts as a motor of capital's expansionist logic and of its idealization. The constant confusion of quality and quantity and their superimposition in the fetish is not an impediment, so this contradiction is not an impediment, but the very driving force that sustains and implicates the subject within the social field. A subject that believes in the value of things, in the value of its world, in the value of itself. Capital, of course, does not prescribe a particular belief, but demands only that you believe. It is thus precisely the liquidation of all intrinsic value that becomes the condition of its continued production. So it's no particular belief that one believes in, but nonetheless one has to believe in belief itself. At least that's the argument I'm making. Intrinsic value does not disappear, but appears to the subject now as a thing in itself withdrawn, a certain je ne sais quoi that essentially evades its grasp, a promise given as unfulfilled. Matter, likewise, the qualitative substrate, we could say, of the commodity, becomes grist for the mill, to quote Benjamin, of the humid backroom of spiritualism, which thrives above all on the continual manufacture of optimism, the belief in progress, and the ultimate goodness of the human soul. Capital needs such sentimental narratives. It needs to believe in the integrity of the person. Personhood becomes the site through which the objective reign of capital subjectivates itself. So even if capital is the general dissolvent of sacralizing relations, as Alain Badiou has remarked, it does not do away with the very form of the sacred. So what I'm saying is it separates actually the content of the sacred from its form, and it retains then a pure form of the sacred. As Marx himself writes, and so here one should attend to the brackets, which obviously you can't attend to because they're only visible, but I'll try to maybe mark those off. So as Marx himself writes, in the money relation, in the developed system of exchange, bracket, and this semblance seduces the Democrats, the ties of personal dependence, of distinctions of blood, education, etc., are in fact exploded, ripped up. Bracket, at least personal ties all appear as personal relations. Okay, so this is really what I'm leaning on. And individuals seem independent. This is an independence which is at bottom merely an illusion, and is more correctly called indifference, free to collide with one another and to engage in exchange within this freedom. So this is the way in which capital thrives off of a negativity that restores through negation a relation to the whole, namely a whole, rather than dividing it. Okay, so that's probably is a little bit obscure. The whole, in that sense, would be the very form, the form of the sacred. So that, in other words, the negation, what is being negated is a particularity, any particular sacred relation. But what then appears as a negation, as a dissolving function, is actually resutured, so to speak, through maintaining the integrity of the subject. So that you have basically what happens is so the capital does in fact dissolve, let's say, sacred relations. But it dissolves them as the objective basis upon which society is, say, grounded. But those very sacred relations now necessarily migrate from an objective basis into a subjective, they have now a personal subjective synthetic function. So that, in other words, religion migrates from being an objective foundation into being a subjective foundation. And so you have a proliferation of religions, so it no longer matters what you believe, but namely that you believe, just to repeat that sort of formula. The inscription of things into the system of their exchangeability and the commodification of the real entails that all things are either really or potentially already inserted into this system is then a process of their sacralization. As Marx stresses, the fetish is an intrinsic, not an extrinsic feature of the commodity. This is perhaps why Benjamin, in a crucial fragment, suggests that capitalism is a religion, answering the question that religion has always served to answer, namely the question of meaning, serving to satisfy, Benjamin writes, the same worries, anguish, and disquiet formerly answered by so-called religion. The commodification of the real saturates the world of things with value, and in turn then saturates them with a kind of meaning. However, capital saturates the world of things, imbuing them with sense, giving even the most useless of trinkets social value, paradoxically by liquidating it. Meaning is produced through its liquidation. It is thus a nihilism of meaning, a mysticism of the nothing, right? So that, in other words, there's no, it's a kind of, there's always the promise of meaning, but the meaning itself is always withdrawn as soon as one sort of looks for it. The meaning of things, grounded in their sense of value, which in the last instance is empty, money as a caput mortem, is grounded in nothing other than this very social need for meaning. It is the metaphysical need for meaning as such, separated from all content, that becomes the basis for the subject's social inscription within capital. Capital needs subjects that look for sense, for value in things. As a result, capital precipitates the subject into a world where meaning value is universally promised, easily accessed, and yet irreparably withdrawn. If the religious consists in establishing a separation amongst things, a division between the sacred and the profane, between things usable and things withdrawn from use, capital generalizes the division. The division is thus no longer between different orders of things, but inscribed into the very thing in itself. There is thus no longer an exception within the order of things. Rather, things themselves, each and every, are themselves both the norm and the exception. All things are thus withdrawn from use, sacralized, and in the same gesture handed over to use, thereby profaned. So the very same gesture is both one of sacralization and profanation. The obliteration of the sacred coincides with the very movement of sacralization. The promise of being coincides with its obliteration. And this is how I interpret this one sort of suggestive comment in that same fragment by Benjamin, when he says religion is no longer the reform of being, but rather its obliteration. The value form produces an emptiness, the abstraction of the value form, which then depends constantly on being filled. Destruction, the destruction of the social bond, the dissolution of the sacred, is never a pure means pursued for its own sake, but harnessed to the production of value. And capital then is not a true nihilism, but to adopt a concept dear to Guy Debord, a pseudo-nihilism. And perhaps Benjamin's most radical and perilous gesture consists in his wager on a true nihilism, what he calls in the surrealism essay a revolutionary nihilism, in contradistinction to the pseudo-nihilism of capital that I just tried to describe. So Marxism, understood as the ruthless critique of everything existing, is more adequately engendered then, perhaps, within dystopian figures, in subjects whose lucidity with respect to their time stems from their detachment from a profound disgust with life, a certain misanthropy, and perhaps even a cold and cynical indifference. A nihilist, as Turgenev writes, is a person who does not take any principle for granted, however much that principle may be revered. And Benjamin, in the same essay, in this realism essay, suggests that an emancipatory politics is ill-served by such compromises of sentiment, the coupling of idealistic morality with political practice. He thus argues that the cult of evil, characteristic of the romantic pessimism of the 19th century, from Baudelaire and Ducasse to Rimbaud, and inherited by surrealism, is a political device to protect thought against such moralistic infection. Or in my terms, to protect thought, we could say, against the need to believe in the personal integrity of the moral subject. Georges Bataille, likewise, in the use value of the Marquis de Sade, adopts a similar position, forging a perverse link between the libertine and the revolutionary. It's a quote: "Without a sadistic understanding of an incontestably thundering and torrential nature, there could be no revolutionaries, there could only be a revolting utopian sentimentality." It is thus the cultivation of what I would like to call Luciferian lucidity, hence now to the title of the paper, with Raja Kaiwa, that engenders practices literary, artistic, and theoretical that can resist the sclerotic, liberal, moral, humanistic ideal of freedom that continues to haunt, let's say, our ideological present. So pessimism and the hatred of the existing order becomes the difficult air that the revolutionary must breathe, requisite for coming to grips with the current desolation of experience. For Benjamin, the Luciferian strain of Romanticism consists in the affirmation of the forces of dissolution, seeing them as not merely characteristic of the external world, the world of natural decay, but identifying them with what is most internal, to borrow from Kleist, the inner sanctum of the soul. It is the soul's dissolution that torments Romanticism, engendering its reactionary as well as its most radical tendencies. To liquidate, then, means to oppose the non-existence of the soul to the hollow promise of a soul, bone to Geist. Far from excluded from the categories of the value form, the notion of a soul is intrinsic to its structure, so much so that it seems to suggest a universal animism. Insofar as all things have value, all things are ensouled, answering more decisively to metaphysical than to physical needs. Countering the ensouling power of capital, its universal animism, it becomes decisive to divide Romanticism, splitting it, as Raja Kaiwa does, between its satanic, a soul possessed, and its Luciferian tendency, a soul dispossessed. So Kaiwa locates the birth of this tendency, the birth of this attitude, the Luciferian attitude, in the 19th century, in the wake of the French Revolution. And he argues that this Luciferian strain of pessimism is engendered by the melancholia infecting the defenders of his rebellious precursor, Satan. An image of irreconcilability, the satanic becomes for the romantics a paradigmatic model of spiritual revolt and the desire to wage by force or guile eternal war against tyranny. As an attitude, the satanic is diffident, carbuncular, impetuous. It is manifest in disobedience and the drive to upset an established order and an unquestioned set of values. The expression of a soul racked with deep despair, the satanic makes rebellion into an end in itself. Refusing to accept the state of affairs, questioning God's goodness, Satan refuses to become an instrument of a higher power. Faced with an impossible victory, Satan nonetheless commits himself to the perversion of the victor's aim. how am I doing on time, actually? Okay, just fine. Okay, good. The literary investment in the Satanic has its basis, according to Kaiwa, in the destruction of the artist's place within the social structure. With the corrosion of the system of patronage that procured for the artist a secure social basis and a means of subsistence, the artist takes on an autonomous social status, becoming a free thinker, as he puts it, a prototype of the intellectual. And a new breed, then, of rebellious subjectivity is born. So lacking an appointed position within the social order and viewing himself evermore as exile, as a misunderstood outsider, the artist-writer assumes the role of a critic of that social order and feels with a certain acuteness the instability of the human's place in the world. Attuned to the ways in which the subject is in turn subjected to domination within the social order, he marshals his critique around the defense of the essential autonomy of the individual. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. As such, Satanism is a bourgeois disorder engendered by the unforeseen, unacceptable, and disheartening obstacles that followed in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and the failure of this revolution to truly secure for the individual the autonomy and freedom he or she was promised. Satanism, Kaiwa writes, was an authentic collective force searching for an image that could condense and valorize these acute and commonly shared aspirations, an image that would be a sign, incitement, and example. As the celestial projection of man's demands, Satanic mythology, the angel of evil, appears as an instinctive and courageous but heedless revolt against the existence of evil and established powers. However, driven primarily by sentiment and moral impulse, Satanism risks becoming a compensatory image, a melancholic projection which compensates for the lack of individual freedom. Kaiwa writes, his followers seem to assert the rights of the individual without being able to do more than despair in ever exercising them. Their disdain poorly masks their impotence, disorientation, and lack of practical sense. So the Luciferian corrective is Machiavellian, accepting that force is the law of the world and abandoning the romantic notion of revolt for revolt's sake. Lucifer, in contrast to Satan's impassioned irrationalism, is cool and cunning, disdainful, contemptuous, and severe. His taste for transgression is constrained, according to Kaiwa, by self-discipline. Having enough faith in his rebellion to view it as a future order, he does not tolerate any indiscipline from any source that might undermine it. Understanding that satanic revolt does not rely on force of arms, but cunning, the Luciferian opposes constrained and pointed wit to outbursts of emotion. The mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Driven by a thirst for lucidity, not sentiment, the Luciferian strips the satanic of its melancholia. Lucifer is entirely focused on what is possible and undertakes it without delay. The Luciferian, then, is not only an attack on individualistically oriented revolt, an attack on what Pierre Navy might call disorganized pessimism. It is also an attack on the way in which Satan is an image that seeks to valorize its current subjection. If Luciferian lucidity is essentially turned back on itself, the principle of his authority is a severity applied only to himself, Kaiwa says, it is because it seeks its own dissipation, its own negation, and not its own valorization. So what I'm arguing here is that the Luciferian will try to separate a kind of negation that I'm calling dissipation from the negation that can reproduce the very form of value. And it does so it does this, it seeks its own negation through attacking itself at its very core, the belief in belief. So this is the very way in which the subject is inscribed within the capitalist order. At least that's what I'm claiming. The Luciferian then attempts to divest the living of its very belief in life. Satanism's escape into the humid back room of spiritualism, like all such escapes, is in search of some sign, some hidden order that could restore man's place in the world. It is an attempt to reorient itself in a world through finding a reason to believe. To be done with belief, however, could be the revolutionary nihilist slogan animating the anti-utopian strain of Marxism. Action that is not undertaken for the sake of a better future, but out of disgust with life, the moronic iniquity of human all too human folly. It does not locate its revolutionary impetus in hope or faith, but despair. As Pierre Navy writes, quote, "A certain despair is the lot of serious, unwearied minds, severely applied to their object, always to themselves in every age. We are talking of the human, that is, all in all, of the living sense of desertion and perdition. Pessimism is at the source of Hegel's philosophy and is also at the source of Marx's revolutionary method." So, to dispossess consciousness then of its sense of propriety, of its belief in itself, the belief in the ownership of experience. This is the Luciferian task par excellence. I am my experience. Such primitive certainties must be questioned. We still have much to learn then from the most unsettling of the implications of Kant's conception of the transcendental. I am not the author of my experience. Something in me conditions it, and I, my personal I, is merely the impersonator of something foreign. I am a spiritual automaton. Such a subject no longer experiences itself as a person endowed with inalienable qualities, but as a set of reflective operations, as in Valéry's Monsieur Test, as a marionette deprived of grace, as in Kleist on the Marionette Theater, as a tailor's dummy, as in Bruno Schulz's Streets of Crocodiles, as a machine, as Andy Warhol will claim. So it experiences itself as being, in some sense, a mechanical operation, as an artifice. So at its most extreme, the nihilist experiences itself as a vacancy absorbing space, to quote Helen Keller. Sorry, I just wanted to slip that in. So everything that is one's own, that one would associate with one's innermost property, suddenly seems to be the possession of something else, an alien being that has awkwardly assumed one's place. One experiences oneself then as a persona, a being acted by another, a mask covering the face of the void, a thing impersonated by another. Personhood, which in the Christian tradition comes to connote the very spiritual core of the individual, the soul's imprint, right, as manifest in the death mask, is suddenly restored to its etymological roots in the Greek prosopon, mask. One experiences oneself then as an impersonation. And I think this is how we should see the lineage of Rimbaud's famous formula, I as another. Okay. So, to become the impersonator of oneself, an uncanny contradictory proposition. I'm skipping over a short section that sort of relates this to Marx's theory of alienation, because I think it's important to see the differences between, I think, or at least the account that I'm hoping to put forward from, let's say, that more classical account of alienation, but maybe we can return to that in the question and answer, because I don't want to, I guess I'm a little bit worried about time. So to become the impersonator of oneself, an uncanny contradictory proposition, a task already performed, I believe, by the dandy, the figure who knows that the soul inexists, but performs its very inexistence nonetheless, attaching the self to the ephemera that composes the skeletal architecture upon which the soul is then hung. If there is a certain camaraderie between the dandy and the nihilist, it consists in the perception of their shared perception of futility of value. The most radical of romantic tendencies, the Luciferian, does not make use of the nothing to reproduce value. If capital is an indefatigable eater with an iron jaw, the jaw of the true nihilist is locked. Dialectic at a standstill or methodological lockjaw. A nihilist, Nietzsche writes, and this is one of his sort of, I guess, lesser quoted definitions of nihilism. A nihilist is a man who judges of the world as it is, that it ought not to be, and of the world as it ought to be, that it does not exist. It's a really nice formulation. Let me just say it again, because it's kind of obviously hard to catch. A nihilist is a man who judges of the world as it is, that it ought not to be, and of the world as it ought to be, that it does not exist. If we take up this most lucid of Nietzschean formulas for nihilism, we find ourselves in the grip of a thought that cripples synthesis. The first judgment counsels pessimism. The world as it exists is odious, wretched, filled with despair. It ought not to exist. It is a moral judgment. Given the state of things, it is preferable to have never been born. This is what Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy described as the wisdom of Silenus. The world would be better off if it is destroyed. Let the world go to ruin. That is the only politics, as Marguerite Duras says in The Truck. The nihilist seeks the destruction of the world as it is. It ought not to exist. But she also seeks the destruction of the will towards its transformation, the desire to make the world better. The first judgment is evaluative. The second denies the very movement of evaluation. The first claim perverts the movement of evaluation, and the second undermines evaluation as such. So the logos gets lockjaw. This is neither resignation. One is not resigned to the world as it is, nor is it utopian. Neither empiricist nor idealist. The formula subtracts existence, at least this is the claim, as such from value, from the ought. So it asserts, so the claim is that the first claim, the world as it is ought not to exist. That's clearly, obviously, a moral judgment. The second one, the world as it ought to exist, does not exist. Then states the fact that the desire for morality itself is precisely what has to be negated. So it's not strictly speaking a double negation in Hegel's sense, but what I'm claiming is that it asserts two negations that then suddenly are related through an immediacy. So it's what actually Deleuze would call a disjunctive synthesis. So it's not a double negation in the sense that it doesn't move forward. It's sort of just it asserts a radical separation, and then its power lies in effectuating that separation. So that's how I'm understanding this dialectic at a standstill. So if the ontological task, where did I, so logos gets lockjaw, the formula, testing the mind's capacity to detach itself, so the formula subtracts existence as such from value, from the ought, testing the mind's capacity to detach itself from the religious need upon which capital, as I suggested earlier, is essentially parasitic. So if the ontological task of true nihilism is to separate the nothing from the nothing, to think, to borrow Deleuze's formulation, a negativism beyond all negation, its practical task concerns learning how to embrace a sense of the self that consists in its own dissipation. The dandy's heroism, as Baudelaire put it, is here not without interest. And Camus, in The Rebel, argues that the dandy is the true inheritor of Romanticism. Now, the dandy is the Luciferian counterpart of the most satanic figures, namely the libertine. So what I'd like to do here is sort of maybe just end with an opposition between, maybe we could say the figure of the profligate, which would be the, and in counterposition to the figure of the libertine. So the libertine, as Camus, I think, accurately describes, is sort of driven by this sense of outrage. So it pursues evil, but out of sentiment, right? Out of outraged innocence, as he puts it. And so it seeks to overturn the system of values that legitimates its subjection through an experience of intensification, the frenzy of intoxication, through heightened pleasure. So turning pleasure itself into the law of existence, the ultimate law. And this rebellion leads, according to Camus, to what he says, to exaltation taking the place of truth. To this extent, and this is a quote of Camus, the apocalypse becomes an absolute value in which everything is confounded, love and death, conscience and culpability, and in which chaos is achieved through plunging all received values into the abyss. So the romantic and the libertine challenge the society of their time through their assault on the moral and divine law, but ultimately their own judgment is that the only escape of that law is through this kind of apocalyptic end. Now, what Camus will claim is that the dandy emerges as a social form precisely as an attempt to sort of navigate the dead end of this apocalyptic tendency in Romanticism. And it does so by reflecting on the very character of romantic rebellion. So no longer, this is a quote, no longer hoping for the rule or the unity of God, determined to take up arms against an antagonistic destiny, anxious to preserve everything of which the living are still capable in a world dedicated to death, romantic rebellion looked for a solution in the attitude that it itself assumed. The attitude assembled in aesthetic unity all mankind who are in the hands of fate and about to be destroyed by divine violence. The human being who is condemned to death is at least magnificent before he disappears, and his magnificence is his justification. So this is Camus' reading of the dandy, where the dandy then, that the human being is doomed, but at least it can be magnificent in its doomed existence. Now, what I think is interesting about, I agree with Camus' situating of dandyism within this sort of, force field of the romantic subject. But I think what Camus misses is that, in fact, the dandy's interest in character, so this turn towards the subject, is precisely a turn that seeks to undo the character of the subject that remains, that the figure of the libertine remains bound to, which would be that of fate. So this notion that, in fact, the human being, because of its very mortal existence, is doomed to death, right? So for Camus, the libertine, ultimately its rebellion is against the social order, but its rebellion is ultimately against nature itself. That nature itself is evil precisely because our beings are mortal. So it ends up becoming, this is also, I think, Klosowski's argument, that its own atheism becomes a form of religion. But its magnificence, this is what I'm claiming, the magnificence of the dandy, what is interesting, is a magnificence that consists in the very disappearance of its own character as an intrinsic quality. This is what I'm claiming. I want to claim. So that it is, in fact, what it seeks to do is claim that character is nothing essential to the human, it's nothing natural, but is in fact a purely contingent construction. The dandy seeks to create his own unity through an aesthetic of singularity and negation. And this is Camus himself recognizes this. So polishing, these are a few of the sort of great anecdotes of Beau Brummel, the famous dandy. Polishing one's boots with the froth of champagne, breaking off relations with a lover because she eats cabbage, attributing the cold that one caught to dining in an inn next to a damp stranger. Right? So these anecdotes, the dandy's existence then is pinned to the anecdote that serves through its very contingency to differentiate or mark its very existence. So what the dandy negates is precisely then what I'm saying is the integrity of the soul. The dandy then separates itself from the notion of the person and wholly inhabits the notion that in fact the person is nothing but a persona, which means that the person is nothing but an abstract impersonation of a void, just of a void that it consists as a social relation, that it consists in a social relation. So it subtracts itself from the belief in its genuineness, treating the self as an infantine seam on the brink of vacancy. And this is a nice quote by Hazlitt describing Beau Brummel. We may say of Mr. Brummel's jests that they are of a meaning so attenuated that nothing living's twixt them and nonsense, so that there's nothing between them and nonsense. They hover on the very brink of vacancy. It is impossible for anyone to go beyond him without falling flat into insignificance and insipidity. He has touched the ne plus ultra that divides the dandy from the dunce. But what a fine eye to discriminate, what a sure hand to hit this last and thinnest of all intellectual partitions. Okay, I'm gonna conclude now. I'm gonna just skip over a little bit. So that I think it's not from the Marquis de Sade that we need to learn, but from another sort of literary figure, the figure that becomes in some sense the anti-heroine of Laclos' dangerous liaisons, the Marquis de Merteuil. And what I think is clear, and this is that for the dandy, and this is what separates him very much from the Marquis de Sade, from the libertine, the self is not an animal, but, and this is a quotation, but a gentleman. Right? And what that means is that instinctual reactions, passions and enthusiasms are animal and thus abominable from the perspective of the dandy. Here the dandy temperament diverges most radically or most widely from the romantic, which dominated the major literature of Brummel's time. So dandyism, we could say, consists in the nihilistic game played between the I and the me, identifying itself with the very place where it loses itself, the place in which it becomes an object, that is precisely on this infantine theme in which its subjectivity becomes hinged to a contingent piece of dress or to a very contingent judgment. Namely, I'm going to break up with her because she eats cabbage. Or, if the triumphant bourgeoisie found the Marquis de Merteuil such a shock, it is perhaps because she taught that the dandy, that most perverse of bourgeois formations, pins the joy of existence on a life lived outside of guilt, separating the self from the very cost of meaning. And so the threat then of the dandy is that it's a social formation that is in some sense antisocial, even though its whole existence exists in its sociality. It's that essential paradox. To become a man without content, a self-annihilating nothing, the impersonator of one's own absence. Right? This is, I think, what it means to think through the problematic of dandyism. This deactivation of the negative separates it from the motor of the dialectic. Borrowing then a distinction from Benjamin's enigmatic fragment on fantasy, on the imagination, from the early 20s, the subject that identifies with its own nullity does not identify with his or her own death, right? So this would be more the libertine apocalyptic formation, that you identify with your own conflagration. but with what he calls in this fragment the ewige Vergängnis, the eternal passing away, the movement of defiguration, Entstaltung, that makes room, the nothing separated from the very demand for meaning, the bone, in other words, that I hinted at earlier, that signifies nothing and is thereby the most ruinous of fragments. Okay, so I'll conclude there. Thank you.